Buenas tardes, estimados alumnos. Me da mucho gusto estar con ustedes por estos pocos momentos que vamos a estar juntos por medio de este video. Good evening or afternoon, depending on when you view this video, my wonderfully esteemed students. It brings me great pleasure to be with you all for the next few moments. We're going to be together via this video. So we are now winding down, bringing the quarter to a close. And what I hope to do today is move you all through chapters 7, 9, 11, and 12. And the lecture of necessity is going to not be able to be comprehensive or exhaustive, but it is somewhat of an overview over some of the main takeaways from each of those chapters. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. There's a lot of slides. I'm going to try to move as quickly as I can with you all, and let's see how far we get. All right, so chapter 7 is discussing the term deviance and crime. The terms deviance, crime, social control, those kind of things. And one of the things I want you all to kind of just keep in mind is that deviance is nothing more than a deviation or a violation of a set of normative expectations. Those could be folkways, mores, or in some cases taboos, okay? The varying degrees of violation of those norms, they could be cultural, they could be severe in terms of the sanctions, positive or negative sanctions that are imposed, or they could be minor, okay? I've given this as one example of a deviant act, right? Cheating on a test or cheating in a class. That's a pretty common form of deviance in college. And one thing that's interesting about deviance is that even though we think of deviance as being an aberration or a anomaly that's away from the norm, there's an argument and a case that can be made that deviance is actually pretty common, okay? Because at least from a functionalist perspective, the moment you create a rule, you by necessity create rule breakers, okay? Because it's going to be impossible for very finite human beings, imperfect human beings, to keep perfection to the expectations that are being held to. They're being held to. All right, so on a more somber kind of serious note, these are two of the more egregious examples of what deviance and crime and social control look like. This is a news story that I share consistently with my students. It's very heartbreaking. This was a former classmate of mine. She was working on actually, she had just graduated from the University of Texas, El Paso on her Master of Arts in Sociology with an emphasis in criminology. So she was a criminologist. She was teaching criminology at the University of Texas, El Paso. Joni Eastman was her name. She was a young lady. She was, as you can see, 26 years old. Really just the world was this young lady's oyster. She was married to a dentist. She had 2 children. And shortly after her graduation, something happened at home and she was murdered by her husband, the dentist, who was, as you can see by the headlines, viewed by many people as a good Christian man. So I share that because of the fact that deviance is everywhere. You know, we don't know when deviance is going to come into our lives. When we have DWIs, DUIs, people driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol, husbands beating their wives or wives beating their husbands, parents and caging their children or abusing their children. Deviance is all around us, and these are really extreme examples, but they're examples that continually and consistently come up on a daily basis in our news feeds and in our news stories. Joni, again, what was interesting about her situation was that she was actually, it was later discovered that she had been the subject of a lot of domestic violence. She had been subjected to a lot of domestic violence and domestic abuse. And no one could tell, you know, because every time we saw Joni, she was smiling. She demonstrated an exuberance and a joy and a happiness that wasn't really, I guess, able to be perceived as problematic or troubling. And she was just the kindest person. You know, the other interesting point about that was she did her master's thesis on domestic violence. As a matter of fact, I believe I have it here. Let me see if I can find it. You know, I heard it a long time ago when I was working on my master's degree. And a lot of times the things that we study are things that we are looking for answers for ourselves and to better understand our own experiences in life. And this was true for Joni. So this is Joni's master's thesis. It's titled Homicide Among Intimate Partners, Differences in Gender, Race, Relationship Type, and Weapon Use. And she was studying her own abuse. Now, she couldn't have seen, or maybe she did see, I don't know. We couldn't have certainly seen that she was going to be murdered by her husband, but she had been studying domestic violence and the weapons that domestic abusers use on their spouses. So that's just one interesting insight, very sad, interesting insight, but I think just a personal illustration of how deviance can come into all of our lives. And that's a very extreme one. To go back to the less extreme one, the cheating that I mentioned earlier, students, every quarter, at least in my classes, I've caught one or two students plagiarizing or engaging in academic dishonesty. And it's a pretty common phenomenon, not just for me, but for instructors all across the board. So I've thrown some statistics here to just kind of highlight that deviance, like cheating, is actually pretty common within institutions. Deviance is a consequence of the fact that we're holding people to a particular set of expectations and normative expectations that they will inevitably fail at. So these statistics kind of highlight the commonality or the common presence of cheating in college. And you have to wonder, if it's so common, then why do we have rules against it? If professors are plagiarizing their work, if students are plagiarizing their work, who decides that rules should be in place against that kind of cheating, against that kind of deviant act? And that's a question that certainly can be looked at differently from theoretical perspectives. All right, so your book presents a number of different examples. There's the traditional strain theory, okay, which is associated with Robert Merton, and it's a functionalist perspective. The idea is that individuals we are all socialized to aspire to and to want to attain a particular set of values and goals in life, normative expectations, right? And normative goals, a house, a good paying job, et cetera. And so we're all socialized into the same goals, but there are different means, or actually there are only a certain set of means that society is allowing us to get to those goals, to attain those goals or to achieve those goals, okay? And what happens is, according to Merton, that as people work towards those goals and attainment and realization of those goals, they experience strain. And strain is the stress that you feel in being unable to reach the goals. So to use plagiarism as an example, the student wants an A, they don't trust themselves to be able to produce a quality paper, and so they plagiarize, or they have someone write their paper for them, or any number of different ways to cheat, right? Or they're not able to study for the test, because one of the ways you would do well in a test is by studying for the test. If students don't study for a test and they can't study for a test, then they begin to think of other ways to get the A without having to go through the means that society says you should get the A through, which is through studying and working hard, right? So that's just one example. Merton identified that there's 4 different kind of manifestations associated with strain theory. And one of the ideas with this is that illegitimate opportunity presents itself, or crime presents itself, when people experience particular strain towards the goals that they have, right? So the first one is an innovator. It's a person who accepts the goals that society has, but rejects society's means. Okay, it's a person like, for example, Scarface, who says, I want to get rich, but I don't want to work hard every day, 30 hours a day, 25 hours a day, 24 hours a day, more hours a day than I have in a day, literally. Or like A-Rod. So ultimately this person becomes a drug dealer and tries to make money, quick money, fast money, easy money. Although there is no such thing as easy money in our society. You have Alexander Rodriguez, who was caught using steroids, one of the best baseball players of all time. I think he went to the Hall of Fame or whatever, but he was a steroid user. So you have some individuals who innovate, and an innovator is someone who breaks outside of the norms to get the goal. Okay, that's how you can remember them. A conformist is the majority of us. Most of us will live and die to be conformists, okay, or being conformists. Most of us will live and die because we're conformists, unable to realize a lot of our goals, generally speaking, in terms of like, especially when you talk about economic stratification systems, okay? But by and large, we're all socialized to, I value the goals that we have as a society and then want to attain them through the socially sanctioned and legitimated ways to attain those goals. So some of us who think we're going to get rich easy and fast when we're young, we don't think school's important, and then we drop out, or like, for example, in my case, I drop out, and then I realize I got to get back into school. Some students in this class don't really want to be in school, but they know that's one of the ways that society says you should be able to get to the goals that society has for us, so has socializing us into. And so you end up with individuals. Now, the point that I make is that sometimes, we conform and we never get to realize our dreams. My mom was born and raised in poverty, and she stayed at a low wage job for all of her life. Our society says if you work hard and you do your best. She even went to school. She went to school. Even after dropping out as a teen mom, she went back to school. She got a certification and something, and then she spent most of her life in this job that was never going to make her rich and was never going to afford her a home. And that's how she died, and that's how a lot of people live and die. They live and die hoping to see their dreams realized in and through their children or their loved ones or people that are coming after them. But that's a conformist, okay? A person that stays in line, even if they don't necessarily get to the goals that they have, okay? You also have a ritualist, which is a person who rejects the goals that society has for them, generally, like a college student who's like, I don't care about an A, or I'm only in college because my parents want me to be, right? Doesn't want the two houses, the vacations in Hawaii every summer. Doesn't want the gold-plated Trump plane, right? Donald Trump's wealth. Doesn't want any of those things. They're just like, you know what? I'm cool with a one bedroom studio apartment. Okay, I'm cool eating ramen noodles for the rest of my days. So a ritualist is a person who doesn't accept the goals, but actually accepts the means. So they kind of go through the motions and they just kind of accept that this is one of the things they have to do. Okay, so they go through the rituals, right? Now, you also have two other strains or two other manifestations besides the innovator and the conformist and the ritualist. You have the retreatist and the rebel. And actually I mentioned earlier 4, but there's 5, right? So the retreatist is a person that rejects society's goals and society's means of attaining those goals. So you could think of maybe a homeless person who's just kind of given up in the rat race of life. They're no longer chasing wanting to get wealthy. They're no longer chasing wanting to get a home. They're no longer even chasing wanting to get a job. They just kind of like reject the goals and reject the means of society. And they'll live with their dogs on the side of the street, right? You also have rebels, who are people that reject the goals and the means of society, but as opposed to a retreatist, they want to destroy the values and the goals that society has, right? So a good example of that is Ted Kaczynski. A good example of that would be the Manson family during the 1970s. So that's string theory in a nutshell. You also have control theory by Travis Hershey. And this theory is a really important theory in helping us not necessarily see why people become deviant, but actually why people don't become deviant, right? So there's 4 dimensions to control theory according to Travis Hershey. And the idea behind this is that the likelihood of not engaging in deviant behaviors is influenced by each of these components being present in your life. So the stronger attachments, commitments, involvement, and beliefs to society's norms and values that a person has, the stronger the relationship to those things, the less likely they are to engage in deviant behavior. And I'll use myself as a perfect example. We could use Troy Kell as another example of control theory. So a person, if they're not going to be deviant, and here's a mental exercise you can engage in. Think of a person who has gone wayside. They're in trouble in life. Probably try to think of someone that maybe has gone to jail or is really hooked on drugs or in trouble with some kind of situation in their lives, okay? Someone who's gone wayside. Think of that person and see if this applies to them, if Hershey's control theory can make sense of their situation. So Hershey said that a person is less likely to be deviant if they have a set of really meaningful attachments in their life. So it's not a coincidence that children in single-parent households are at greater risk of incarceration, earlier police contact, and greater likelihood of dropping out of school, right? Like that's a relationship that's present in all of the family of sociology of the family studies that show that children in single-parent households are more likely to engage in deviant behavior. And I'm evidence of that. I was raised in a single parent household and I was arrested before I finished high school, and I dropped out of high school and I was using drugs at an early age, et cetera, right? So someone who doesn't have attachments is more likely to engage in deviant behavior. So you need 2 parents, right? And maybe you don't need 2 parents. Maybe you need 2 grandparents. The point is you have to have a set of relationships that you can attach to. And these attachments have to lead into this next point, which is there has to be a set of commitments and there has to be some degree of commitment in the relationships and the attachments that a person has. So it's not just that you need two parents, because, you know, a lot of the times when I was engaged in deviant behavior as a young child, as a young adult, I would visit kids that had two parents, but their parents were never home. Really nice upper middle class homes, always filled with food in the fridge. You know, the food was stocked, the cars were nice, but the parents were never home. And I would ask these kids, hey, where are your parents? And they'd be like, they're just too busy making the dollar. They're chasing the greenback, you know. So it's not enough to just have two parents, because what if your two parents are always working, right? There has to be a set of commitments to the relationship, and commitments that can be demonstrated, right? So time with those individuals, time with those attachments, time with those relationships, engaging in meaningful activities for both parties, right? So you have to have not just two attachments to people, but you have to have a commitment to those relationships. You also have to have some kind of involvement in socially sanctioned activities, right? So the more engaged in extracurricular activities children are, or young adults are, the less likely they are to engage in deviant behavior. And the reason for this, of course, is you're less likely to want to go get stoned or get drunk if you know you're going to have to go play soccer with your coach. And so engaging students or having children, young adults involved in socially approved activities, socially sanctioned activities, minimizes and reduces the likelihood of them engaging in deviant behavior. Most of the time also because they have to engage with some kind of adult. An adult, in most healthy relationships, healthy adults do not want to see children engaging in escapism through substance abuse, alcohol consumption, or drug abuse. Okay, most healthy adults don't want to see other adults doing that, but much less young adults. So, so if you're going back to that person that I asked you to think about at the beginning of the slide, did that person have a set of attachments and people in their life? Did they have a commitment from those people to be involved in that relationship or in the relationships they had with them? Were those individuals involved in any kind of extracurricular or socially approved activities? Did they play soccer? Did they play football? Did they, like for the schools, right? Were they cheerleaders? What kind of things were they doing with their spare time? And the more things you're doing with your spare time with adults and other people that's healthy and socially approved, the less likely you are to start doing drugs and alcohol. And that was true for me. You know, I didn't have money to play any kind of club sports. I was never involved in any kind of extracurricular, school sanctioned extracurricular activities. And it caught up with me. You know, devil's time is idle time is the devil's time, is what they say. Right. So last but not least, you have to have some kind of belief in the norms and the values of the broader society in which you live, and the involvement that you're engaging in, and the commitments that you have, and the attachments that you have as well. And a good example of this is what happened to me. So I shared right now that I used to actually play basketball, but not with a team. I couldn't memorize the plays and stuff like that, but I was really, really talented at basketball. And for a long time, this kept me away from using drugs, because my friends would say, hey, let's go get stoned, or let's go get drunk, or let's go do this or that, right? And I would say, no, it's okay. I'm going to keep practicing my free throw. And I would stay hours practicing my free throw, my layups, my three-pointers. And I remember one time, one of my friends said, bro, you're 5'8", and you're Mexican American. Like, you're not going to go to the NBA, bro. Just come with us. And I remember that moment really just kind of clarified for me what I was doing with my time, which is I was chasing a dream that I wasn't going to see realized. And I lost my belief in the goodness of the norms and the values that I had internalized as a child. And guess what? Yeah, the likelihood of me being arrested increased. And I was arrested and got in trouble with the law. So that's control theory. The same thing was true for Troy Kell. If you remember the documentary you saw, Troy Kell didn't have attachments. He didn't have commitments. In terms of involvements, he liked to get stoned. He liked to get drunk. And he really didn't believe that there was any value in a lot of things that people were asking him to do, especially adults. All right. You have differential association, which is a symbolic interactionist theory. And this is very much associated with the idea that crime is learned. You know, crime is learned through intimate relationships. And that's where association comes in. Differential association is basically, if you were to translate it, you would say a different set of associations, right? A different set of associations lead you into a different set of life, a different crime, or a different area or walk of life. So sometimes the media can, this was actually really important. Edwin Sutherland actually had this theory before the media came into prominence in the 1920s and 30s. But what he said is that people learn how to engage in criminal activity from other criminals. They don't learn it necessarily through watching movies and TVs. Now, movies and TVs were not popular at the time, okay, but now they are. And so I use Biggie Smalls' 10 Commandments sometimes as an example of how people can learn how to deal drugs, for example, from listening to a song. Or can they, right? The question is, does music influence people's criminal behavior or likelihood to engage in criminal activity? Does TikTok influence people's behaviors to engage in deviant behavior? Lots of arguments pro and con, although I think most of the research is now kind of showing that, yeah, the media influence is pretty profound. So differential association is another theory. That's a symbolic interactionist theory. The other point associated with this is deviance occurs as conditions favor violation of the law over compliance to it. So what that means is when it is easier to produce methamphetamine or fentanyl and get money from that than it is to find a job, you're going to have a lot of fentanyl dealers. Like that's what we're talking about there. And when it's easier to find people to teach you how to make fentanyl or methamphetamine or crack cocaine in the 1990s than it is to get a job and get called for an interview in a job and pass the job interview, then you're going to see an increase in deviant behavior like that. So, and again, that goes back to differential opportunity, illegitimate opportunity structures. Okay. All right. A third theory is labeling theory. And when we talk about labeling theory, we're talking about two types of theory or two types of labeling that take place. You have primary deviance and then you have secondary deviance. It is possible to have deviance without anyone engaging in a deviant act. And that is because of the fact that primary labeling can take place. Primary labeling can take place and ultimately label a person as a deviant even without them having ever done anything. Now that's where you end up with the self-fulfilling prophecy, the snowball effect, the Pygmalion effect kind of manifesting itself. But you have primary deviance, which is when the initial act of rule breaking takes place. And then you have secondary deviance, which is all of the compounding effects and interactions that people have with the individual who engage in deviant behavior and has now been labeled, for example, a stoner, for example, a criminal, for example, a plagiarist, for example, a murderer, right? And you see labeling theory, especially, for example, with what happens to felons after they're released from prison or sex offenders. They have to report. The news broadcasts that they're moving into a neighborhood. I mean, it's just all of these secondary deviant behaviors or secondary actions that take place. And what happens is that eventually, there's a way for an internalization, and that's part of the developmental psychology and developmental socialization process. But primary deviance is the initial act. Secondary deviance is everything that kind of comes with it as a result of the audience's response to the primary deviance that a person engaged in. Okay, one good example of how labeling works is how we know someone is mentally ill, or how do you know the sane from the insane, to use a classical term. There was a study by a guy named D.L. Rosenhan who actually wanted to really look at how medical experts can identify someone who is insane, who has a mental illness, as opposed to someone who doesn't have a mental illness and is sane. And so what he decided to do was he actually went ahead and he basically recruited a number of different people, housewives, lawyers, doctors, students, and he asked them to go ahead and be willing to go into a mental health institution and check themselves in, basing themselves on the fact that they say they're hearing voices. And once he told them, once you get in, what I want you to do is I want you to just be yourself, be normal, whoever you are. Okay. And I want to see how long it takes for these people to see that you're not insane, that you don't have a mental illness. Okay. So he sends these like 20 or 30 individuals into different hospitals, mental institutions across the country. And I think it was like 2 or 3. And the really interesting thing is, and going back to what I was sharing, the really interesting thing is that when you have, let me see if I can go back to sharing. Sorry about that, everybody. Gotta go back all the way to where I was with D.L. Rosenhan. Okay, there we go. And what ultimately happened with D.L. Rosenhan was, so he sent these individuals in, they're there, and lo and behold, the doctors aren't figuring out that these people are not mentally ill, that they don't have any kind of insanity. And apparently some people ended up staying there quite some time. And they started panicking. So what they did is they started telling the doctors, hey, I'm actually here as a result of an experiment. I'm not mentally ill. I'm not hearing voices. I was part of a psychology, sociology experiment to see if you could tell that I was not mentally ill, that I was not suffering from insanity. And what do you think the doctors said? Right? How do you think the doctors responded to this patient in a mental facility, a mental hospital, saying, hey, I'm not mentally ill. I'm actually just here as a part of an experiment. Of course, they said, no, you need to take your pills. Sorry. Yes, I know you're part of an experiment. They basically didn't believe them. Now, the really crazy thing was that the doctors couldn't tell that these people were not insane. But you know what? Who could tell in the experiment? The patients inside the mental hospitals actually would point at these participants and say, you're not mentally ill, you're not supposed to be here. Like, you're a spy. And what's crazy is that this whole study really challenged and problematized labeling, right? Which is like, how do doctors know who is mentally insane, criminally insane? How do you know that someone has a mental illness, and how do you know the sane from the insane? And so that was just one study, but that's the labeling effect, right? The power of labeling is, if you're labeled someone mentally ill and they tell you they're not, good luck with that. Good luck with that for them. All right. So your book also talks a little bit about crime, lots of different types of crime, street crime, victimless crime. Victimless crime would be crimes that are associated, for example, with prostitution, where you have consensual parties. Street crime is associated certainly with robberies, burglaries, those kind of things, auto theft. And it's street crime is the thing that we're most prevalently exposed to, but it's not the most economically burdensome. It's not the most costly to our economy and to our society. Okay, not financially. A lot of times street crimes related to differential opportunity or illegitimate opportunity structures. We have something called corporate crime, and the corporate crime is actually the more expensive. It has the greatest financial impact on our society. Here are a couple of examples, right? These individuals are executives from Enron, who led one of the greatest, most recent times, one of the greatest white collar crimes. It was basic fraud all the way across the board. Bernie Madoff with a Ponzi scheme, billions of dollars. Martha Stewart, insider stock trading. So fraudulent contracts, the fudging of books, that's corporate crime, okay? Sometimes you have corporate crime that's being done by executives at, like, for example, at Ford. I put the Ford Pinto because in the 1970s, it was discovered that the Ford Pintos could catch fire if they were in an accident that was involved in the rear getting hit because of where the gas tank was placed. And what Ford decided to do was estimate the cost associated with replacing all of the fuel tanks on the Ford Pinto, and the cost of paying out a compensation for the death of or injury of a loved one in an accident with a Pinto that hadn't been fixed. And the numbers said that it's more expensive to replace the gas tanks. And so Ford's leadership decided to leave the gas tanks in place, and people died because it was financially more expensive to remove or redesign the Ford Pinto and place the gas tanks in a less dangerous place. So there's that's going on there. One term that's not mentioned necessarily in your text, but I want you to be mindful of, is recidivism. And recidivism is an important term because it's talking about, okay, what do we do about people who continue to commit crime? You know, people in America have civil rights. We have constitutional rights that we're afforded. We're protected from cruel and unreasonable punishment. And we're promised freedom, you know, in our society to a certain degree. So eventually people who commit crimes are going to come back out of prison unless we like lock them up for eternity. And the recidivism is a term that's really important to think about, because what do we do with the people once they get out? And this is an example, a personal example of recidivism. This is a former student of mine. And I did not know he was wanted. I and my students in the class did not know that while he was attending class with us, that he was on El Paso's most wanted. He was a felon. He was wanted for some pretty serious crimes, right? He raped a woman. He assaulted his girlfriend. He tried to kidnap his girlfriend. And the whole time he was attending class. Like the whole time he was a wanted felon on the run, he was in my classroom doing sociology, and he was flirting with the girls, and he was very kind and respectful to me. And so that goes back to this idea of like, you don't even know the person sitting next to you, right? We don't know the crew of the criminals are, because Gilbert Orozco did not look like a criminal, whatever a criminal looks like. He didn't behave like a criminal. He submitted his work on time. He was respectful. He was charming. The girls certainly liked him in the class. He was consistently flirting with them, and they would flirt back. So you have this this dynamic that this highlights recidivism, right? This person was arrested numerous times and was still out in public, even though he was a danger and a threat to the community. He was in our sociology class. So it wasn't until after class, after the quarter ended, that I found out that he was on El Paso Limos 1. All right. So you have general deterrence. Most of the time that's associated with prisons and jails. Your book talks a little bit about prisons and jails. The difference is basically how much time someone's going to spend. Usually, if it's going to be more than a year and a half or so that you're going to be serving, you probably will be sent off to prison. Right now, because we have our prisons filled and we don't have enough capacity, we are using a lot of what's called specific deterrence, and that's like parole and probation. And that's basically a releasing of individuals to the public with some kind of supervision, whether it's an ankle bracelet or checking in with a parole officer or probation officer, simply because we can't build prisons fast enough and we don't have enough space. Okay. All right. Chapter 9. Like I said, I apologize that I'm talking so long, but this is the final lecture that I will be presenting information for you all with. So hopefully this helps everybody. Chapter 9 is about stratification, and I'm going to try to move as quickly as I can here. One thing I want you to be mindful of is that stratification is basically related to the other chapters. So chapters 9, 11, and 12. Chapter 9 is stratification, which is economics. Chapter 9, chapter 11 is race and inequality, racial inequality, race and ethnicity. And then chapter 12, so 9, 11, and 12 are all about these really dynamics of discrimination and dynamics of stratification. So stratification in chapter 9 is discussing the economic disparities associated with unequal distribution of resources and opportunities. So to give you all an example of what stratification looks like, I am presenting you with the Titanic. So the Titanic, you all know it was a massive ship. And what you're looking at here are the death rates and survival rates, actually, of people who were able to be spared on the Titanic. People who died. What was interesting is there were patterns to who lived and who died on the Titanic. And much like the Titanic, right, the SS Titanic, we have SS Society. Society is like a ship that people are going to look for lifeboats on. And there are particular identities or positionalities that people possess that is going to have an impact on your access to the lifeboat. And basically your access to whether or not you survive or your dreams survive. So it's a really kind of pointed, and now on the Titanic, there were economic dynamics to who was going to live and who was going to die. So it's not a coincidence that the great majority of people in first class survived. Okay. Well over the rates of all the other people. Okay. So 32% of men and 97% of women and children in the first class survived. And that's because in society, and you'll notice in our society, who does survive? Who succeeds? It's the wealthy, right? The wealthy survive. The Jeff Bezos, the Bill Gates, the Donald Trumps, they survive a lot, right? And they are able to acquire a lot of resources. So, and it's not a coincidence that other positionalities had an influence on who lived or who died, right? So now, unlike the SS Titanic, in our system, and by the way, so let me go back. On the Titanic, it was also in third class, you had predominantly immigrants, just so you know. It was predominantly the immigrants in third class or steerage, and they had the highest death rates. And that's not a coincidence either, because in our society, immigrants don't have a lot of standing. Immigrants aren't afforded a lot of opportunity, a lot of access to opportunity or resources. A lot of times immigrants are given the scariest neighborhoods to live in, the scariest homes and housing to live in, the scariest conditions to live in. They're not given the best food, right? And that a lot of times is associated with the labor or the segment of the niche in the labor market that they're associated with. So you had on the Titanic, you had racial and you had class dynamics contributing to who lived and who died. And in our society, you have three dynamics. You have racial, you have economic, and you have gender dynamics to who lives and who dies. Or more importantly, I would say to whose dreams come true and whose dreams don't. Okay. So that being said, we're all on the Titanic. Actually, we're all on SS Society, right? So going back to this presentation, and that's where chapters 9, 11, and 12 kind of converge, okay? Because chapter 9 begins a conversation about how people determine who gets what and why. That is stratification. And then chapter 11 and 12 talk about race and gender, and that's very much strongly associated to stratification as well. Okay, it's kind of like how, okay, you got a pizza, who gets a slice, right? If there's only 8 slices and there's 10 of us, someone's going to be hungry or someone's going to eat very little. All of us are going to eat very little and be unsatisfied. And so you have that dynamic present. Stratification is about who gets a slice and who doesn't. From a conflict theory perspective, you can see that in terms of income, for example, there's racial patterns. The class conflict perspective argues that there's an unequal distribution of very scarce resources. And the scarce resources and opportunities that are afforded are unequally distributed based on race, class, and gender. Okay. We have ample data to kind of show that that's true, but that's just one perspective. Here are some other kind of some other like images associated with the conflict perspective, right? So the gender pay gap, the racial pay gap, irrespective of education, we see that women earn less than men. We see racial minorities earning less than non-racial minorities. And there's a compounding effect. It's called a cumulative disadvantage. Okay, Black women are hit hard by the race and gender pay gap. We have in chapter 9 a discussion around the different kind of economic systems. So you have caste or systems of stratification. You have a caste system, which is basically a closed system. It's an ascription process that basically says you're born here, and where you're born, you're going to die. Okay, so it's a closed system. Also, what it means by a closed system is your children, if they're born in that system, that means they're going to be born. So, for example, these are the Dalits in India. And the Dalits are the untouchables. You know, if the untouchables have children, then their children are untouchable. And this is very much strongly related to the religious Hindu belief system in reincarnation. So maybe not in this life, but in the next life, you'll have a chance of escaping that closed system. But a caste system is a lifelong ascribed status that you possess. There's a great degree of status inequality in these castes, and usually the more industrialized a society becomes, the less structured and the less hold on society the caste system and ideological beliefs have on the broader society. So it's not a coincidence that as India becomes more and more capitalistic in its orientations, that the caste system is breaking down. Right, because the caste system has historically and predominantly been a religious-based system, and the economic system and the economic ideologies that have kind of seeped into India have begun to weaken the hold that theological arguments make for why people are in positions that they're in. Okay, a lot of endogamous marriages reinforce these ascribed closed systems. So, for example, if you're a Dalit, you marry a Dalit. You don't marry outside of your caste. And there's no way for you to interact with people outside of your caste because you're relegated to the same areas of life, the same work, the same interactions, and the same closed network of people. Okay, all right. So in a social class system, you have an open system, which the idea is that there's a degree of mobility, and you have intergenerational mobility and intragenerational mobility within a class system. So this is very much related to the belief system of the meritocracy, at least in the United States. The meritocracy being that the idea that you are where you are because of your hard work. So there are some questions in the United States by theorists regarding whether or not our class system is an ascribed status system, and if it's not more like a caste system, because social mobility is certainly possible intergenerationally and intergenerationally. And we can always find examples of both, right? So, for example, in my case, I was born in the very bottom of the lower class. The bottom of the lower class, I lived in government housing. I lived in low-income housing. I was very poor. And in my lifetime, which is intragenerationally, I have now been able to experience upward social mobility. I'm no longer at the bottom of the lower class. I'm kind of at the top of the lower class. I'm still poor. Okay. I'm still poor, but I've moved upwards somewhat. So I've experienced upward social mobility. And I also have experienced intergenerational mobility because my mother was born very poor. And even as poor as she was, I've moved up a little bit more than she was when she was born, right? So we have intergenerational mobility, which is from one generation to the next. So my children will hopefully see intergenerational upward mobility, even if I have only seen a little bit. And intergenerationally, my hope is that my children within their lifetime will also move up from the bottom of the lower or the top of the lower class to the top of the middle class, right? Or to the middle of the middle class, et cetera, right? There are some conversations, like I said, around whether or not our class is achieved or ascribed, but that's very much strongly related to your belief or non-belief and subscription to the meritocracy, right? There are some people that are very wealthy who do not work hard at all. And there are some very hard-working people like Tammy who are very poor. Like Tammy or like me. You know, I work really hard. I work 7 days a week, work like 65 hours a week, and I'm still poor. Even though I've got some other kind of perks, right? Because of where I'm at. And that goes into the conversation around socioeconomic status. So SES. Socioeconomic status is comprised of three things. It's the income that a person brings in, the occupational prestige that they occupy or possess, and the educational attainment that they have. Socioeconomic status is a lot of times, like middle class membership is a lot of times identified by educational attainment with a college degree. So most middle class people have an educational credential, and there's some people who measure middle class membership by the educational credential alone, okay? But here's the thing, right? Some people can possess one of these or all three of these in varying degrees and maybe not commensurate with one another. So for example, a doctor has a very high level of educational attainment, has a very high level of occupational prestige, and has a very high level of income. You know, doctors make $350,000, $400,000 a year, okay? And why? Well, they go to school for 12 years, 15 years, right? And because they go to school for 12, 15 years, they're capable of earning and able and afforded the opportunity to earn $400,000 a year. And they're treated like it too, you know, but once you tell someone you're a doctor, they just kind of, people stand in awe of you, right? Now, take that experience of this male doctor here or female doctor, and then compare it to that of El Chapo. So El Chapo Guzman, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, he was a drug leader in Mexico with the Sinaloa cartel. He did not have a lot of education. He was a high school dropout. He did not have a lot of occupational prestige because he was a drug dealer. Who wants to lead a cartel, right? Who wants to be associated with the murder and brutality and dissemination of drugs that are killing people? Nobody. So not a lot of occupational prestige in being a drug dealer, not a lot of educational attainment, but he did have a lot of income. He actually was named one of Forbes' top 400 wealthiest people in the world at one point, right? So that kind of showed the fluid nature of socioeconomic status. And then sometimes, for example, you can have a high level of educational attainment, but not have a lot of occupational prestige or even a lot of income. Like, for example, many of us, when we graduate from college, we have the educational credential and the educational attainment, but we don't have any occupational prestige because we haven't yet landed our first job, and we don't have a lot of income because we just graduated. So that's socioeconomic status. And it's important to keep that most of the time, one of these will bring the others along with them, okay, for the most part. When we talk about socioeconomic status and stratification, we want to make sure that we understand that there's a difference between income and wealth. So when we talk about income, it means the flow of dollars received in a time period. So it's like a river, right? The flow of money coming in. When we talk about wealth, we're talking about what is owed. Actually, well, not what is owed, what is possessed after what is paid out to the debts that you have, right? After what you owe has been paid, how much do you have left over? That's called wealth. So for example, wealth is a lot of wealth in the United States is found in home ownership, okay? Usually wealth is accumulated over time, transmitted intergenerationally, and is pretty much found in home ownership or wealth and or stocks and 401ks, retirement packages, All right. As I shared with you earlier, you have individual social mobility, you have structural social mobility. Sometimes people can move up or down in the social class based on how the economy is changing. So right now with artificial intelligence, a lot of structural changes are coming down the pike. A lot of jobs are going to disappear. And so that's going to probably create some kind of income inequality, and access to opportunities and resources is going to be really, really disrupted by the AI, the artificial intelligence that's shaping the way we do our work, right? So some people lose their jobs and experience downward social mobility because of a change in the economy. So that's what structural mobility is about. And it could be upward or downward, okay? And then you also have individuals upward or downward social mobility, okay? You have horizontal mobility, which is where you stay in the same place economically and you just move to a different position. All right, so going to the theories, the classical functionalist, this is the Moore thesis. You have what you're looking at here is in a traditional meritocratic society, the belief is that people have various levels of expertise, and people with various levels of expertise, the more expertise they possess, should be compensated for their greater expertise. And because they should be compensated for their expertise, they should probably be doing the most demanding and complex work, right? So if you think about your own educational experience, this right here, it kind of highlights it, right? Which is you're looking at your AA. Once you're in your AA, you're kind of guaranteed an opportunity, or given the potential opportunity to earn $35,000 a year in an office as opposed to outside, right? Or in a warehouse. A BA, once you get your BA, you're offered the opportunity, the potential opportunity to earn maybe $50,000 or $60,000 a year. You get your MA, maybe $75,000 a year. You get a PhD, you're looking at something upwards of $100,000, or you get your MD, $250,000, $300,000. You get your Juris Doctorate, maybe $100,000, right? So as your educational attainment increases, and your level of expertise increases, then your compensation generally increases, right? And so from a functionalist perspective, the stratification that is present in our society is directly related to the complexity of the tasks that people perform in our society and the compensation and motivation necessary to move people into those domains, okay? So very few people are going to sacrifice 20 years of their life to be in school to be a medical doctor. It's a quarter of your life if you live to be 100 years. If you live to be 100 years old, you're going to spend 1/4 of your life training to be a doctor. And so very few people are able to make that sacrifice or that commitment, because it's a long time, right? 20 years means you're going to have to hold off on relationships. You're going to be moving around the country constantly. You're going to be reading stuff you don't want to read. You're going to be writing stuff you don't want to write. You're going to be in places you don't want to be. You're going to see things you don't want to see. And so we have to motivate people to want to do those things. And so you attach a big old salary like $400,000 a year. And guess what? People run. Right, so that's a functionalist perspective, and it's easier to train a garbage collector than it is to train a doctor, right? So the garbage collector doesn't make $450,000 a year. The sociology teacher doesn't make $450,000 a year. The school teacher doesn't make $450,000 a year. Now, the critique for this functionalist perspective is who gets to say what's complex work and what's important work, and who gets to say it's not, right? Like, so for example, during the COVID era, during COVID, who became essential workers? It wasn't teachers, it wasn't doctors, it wasn't lawyers, it wasn't judges. All those people were not essential workers. Who was the essential worker? It was the cashiers, it was the managers, it was the cart pushers at our Safeways, at our Costco's. And why did that happen? Well, because at that point we realized, hey, maybe this work is more important than the work of teachers, right? Or at least we gave verbal assent to that. So one of the critiques around the functionalist theory is who decides what is important and what is complex, and what criteria is used to make that sense? Like, why is a teacher less valuable than a medical doctor when a teacher creates the students that eventually become and want to aspire to become doctors, and gives them the math, the science, the reading, and the writing skills that they need to eventually become doctors, right? One could argue that maybe the teacher is even more important than the doctor. Okay, all right, so you've got that. The symbolic interactionist perspective is all about consumption. And this is important because, remember, as I shared with you, this theory says that people engage in conspicuous consumption to demonstrate their social class, right? So all the symbols we're chasing to kind of highlight, like the Mercedes-Benz, the Corvette, the Chrysler 300, right? Like those cars, the clothes you wear, those kind of things are part of the conspicuous consumption. The flying, the Kardashians flying to the Bahamas over the weekend, or to Alpine, right? Or to Aspen, those kind of things. All right. Here's some more examples of the symbolic interactionist perspective, right? So your social class influences the language you use. So in the lower class, language is about survival. In the middle class, language is about negotiation. And in the upper class, it's about networking. Okay. All right. Chapter 9. I'm still going, Boo. What's up? Yes, what's up? I hit pause though, because my voice, I'm losing my freaking voice. I'm talking so long. All right, everybody, I'm going to keep going now. My apologies for that disruption. I had to get something to drink. I'm losing my voice. All right, so I'm going to try to move as quickly as I can through these next two chapters. I just did chapter 7. I'm now doing, what is it? 7, 9, 11, and 12. This is actually chapter 11. Okay, my apologies. All right, so race and ethnicity. So when we talk about race and ethnicity, one thing I want you all to see is that you have, they're not the same, okay? Race is a social construct. Race is a social construct, and historically, we've had a tri-racial system in the United States where historically white Americans, and we'll talk more about the ethnicity of white Americans, but historically white Americans have been at the very top of the racial hierarchy. So white Americans dominated the economic institutions, educational institutions, and they were given access to the opportunities and resources afforded in each of those institutions of the highest quality, as opposed to what non-white Americans were relegated to. So when we talk about race and ethnicity, race specifically is associated with the categorizations, the categorical assumptions and associations that we make based on someone's physical appearance. But it is a social construction. So one thing I want to kind of highlight is when we talk about race, we're talking about, like, for example, Black, white, Latino, Latina, Asian. Those are racial categorizations, okay? Within each of those racial categories, there are a number of different ethnicities, okay? Usually when we talk about race, we're making associations about inferiority, or superiority, okay? Because race is about power, and I'll talk more about that in a second. When we here, for example, there are some ethnicities, like Jews, for example, historically where Jews have been recognized as an ethnic identity, as ethnicities. But what happened during the Holocaust was, because of the dynamics operating in Germany around Jews, you ended up with something called the racialization process taking place. So while Jews were historically an ethnicity, they were racialized and have continued to stay racialized as a result of what happened during the Holocaust, right? All of these assumptions that were made around Jews. And these are just two examples around the fluid nature of race, right? So at some point, Hitler's racial ideology broke down, and so you had to use stars, yellow stars, to identify the Jews, because the physical categorization of Jews was impossible. Jews don't look a particular way. Neither do blacks, neither do whites, neither do Asians. So you have that dynamic going on there. Let me see if I can get this to go. I put this quote up here so you can read it and kind of make sense of it. What racial group do you think this is talking about? They're distinctly marked, the small and somewhat upturned nose, the black tint of the skin. They're ignorant, and as a consequence thereof are idle, thriftless, poor, intemperate, and barbarian. They violate our laws. These wild beasts, leaping over fences, which easily restrain the civilized domestic cattle, will commit great crimes of violence, even capital offenses, which certainly have increased lately, right? So this quote is talking about a particular group of people, and there's probably some associations you make based on what you just read, right? None of you would probably assume that it was talking about the Irish, right? Because this is actually a categorization of racial class stereotype of the Irish during this time. And that actually highlights this point called stereotype interchangeability, which is the things that are said about the Irish in 1850 are said about Mexicans in the 1990s, or about Muslims in after September 11th, or around Asians in the 1890s and 1900s. So stereotype interchangeability is about that, okay? To kind of keep moving on here. When we talk about ethnicity, what we're talking about is the cultural history and the ancestry or heritage that a particular group has. Okay, it's not about power when it comes to ethnicity. Usually the language, the religious practices, the cultural practice, the cultural heritage that people have, that's ethnicity. Okay, American is not an ethnicity. Let me be clear about that. Being American is not an ethnicity. Many of my white students often say, when they do a cultural exercise, and I ask them to identify their cultural history, they start talking about American, but that's not an ethnicity. Being American is a nationality, which is distinct from ethnicity. Okay, so here's a couple of examples here. You have two black females, right? That's the race. They're black, but they have two different cultural backgrounds. Okay, you have two white individuals here, two white males, but they have two different ethnic backgrounds. Okay, one's Jewish and one's Irish. Right, this is a black Jamaican. Now I'm mentioning a black American, even though I just said that being American is not an ethnicity, only because black Americans have had their culture, their ethnic identities erased. Like for black Americans, it's been suppressed. Their ethnic identities have been suppressed or erased completely because of the very long history that they have with slavery and being imported into the United States as labor. Okay, all right. So to kind of keep going on here, here are some contrasts for us. When we talk about race, we're talking about an externally imposed categorization. Race is involuntary and it's all about power. Okay, so for example, it's like how a particular group sees another group. It's hierarchical with moral implications. So for example, the stereotypes around Black Americans, around Latinos, around white Americans, all of them are in relationship to one another. And usually the stereotypes associated with darker skinned ethnic minorities are much more negative and much more insidious. Okay. And then also when we talk about race, it's exclusive. Like for example, Barack Obama is seen as the first Black president. even though he's white, right? They don't call him the first white president because we already had white presidents, but and that actually gives the credence to the idea of hypodescent, okay, which is the idea that if a person is biracial, they will be afforded the racial identity, unless they can pass, they will be afforded the racial identity of the subordinate minority population. All right, so when we talk about ethnicity, we're talking about the fact that ethnicity is voluntary. It's not externally imposed. Ethnicity is self-defined. It's non-hierarchical. So we have, when we talk about like ethnic identities, there's the Irish can celebrate the Irish, being Irish. We can't really see a white American who's Irish versus one who's German. Like there's not the distinctions that we make when we talk about those ethnic differentiations, okay? But now there are some groups that are both, and that's because of the process of racialization that takes place. If you take an ethnic studies class, you'll be able to kind of learn a little bit about that. But the idea is that race and ethnicity are distinct. They are two different things, okay? All right. And this is going to be a point worth mentioning when we talk about discrimination, but race is one of the categorical dynamics that presents itself with institutional or structural discrimination, okay? Here you have a couple of arenas, okay? You have labor markets, educational systems, housing markets, criminal justice system, and healthcare systems. So you have these 5 domains, and race influence, actually race is not a cause of these things, but is very strongly associated with some of the dynamics of discrimination within these institutions. So driving while black, you all, ladies and gentlemen, saw a video on that. The mortgage redlining and the steering that realtors engage in for racial minorities and white Americans. The educational system, rife with this points of discrimination. The labor market's rife with points of discrimination. So you're reading about that in your book as well. Here's some news stories that kind of highlight how race plays itself out. So for example, in schools, you have some teachers that dressed up as Mexicans, and some of them dressed up as a wall that said, "Make America Great Again," at a school where you had Mexican-American students and Hispanic and Latino students. It was in Idaho. Here you have in Pasco, Washington, an African-American mother who is speaking out against a comment that was made by a white student to her black daughter. And it was a racially charged comment saying that she was a slave, or at least alluding to the fact that she was a slave because she was black. And she was upset because the school couldn't do anything. They couldn't punish the young man who said it. They said that they asked him to retract his statements, but there was nothing on the books and the policy that could force some kind of consequence on him. Here you have 2 black men arrested in a Philadelphia Starbucks because they were doing nothing but being black. So race is a very, very pointed dynamic associated with stratification. Because race is so identifiable, it's called identifiability, it makes it a really easy way of targeting. And this is just one example. This example is tragic in the sense that if you are black in a white space, you can be removed, even if you're not breaking the law. You have other examples here. A black Yale graduate student took a nap in her dorm's common room. A white student called the police because it didn't look like she belonged there, whatever that means, right? So even if you go to Yale and you're a student at Yale, if you're black, someone's going to say, "How did you get here?" Right? And there's lots of other examples. This is an example of the disproportionate suspensions and expulsions of students of color. And there's a couple of terminologies that are discussed in our text. Prejudice, remember, prejudice is an attitude. Discrimination is an action. And all of us are subject to prejudicial behavior or prejudicial thoughts, not behaviors, because prejudicial behaviors is ultimately discrimination, but prejudicial thoughts, right? We're socialized into a particular understanding through the process of socialization to make assumptions. And then also we're hardwired through social cognition theory. What they argue is that we're hardwired biologically to make generalizations around the environment around us. So our experiences, the abstractions that we're taught, we internalize dominant norms around people, about people and who they are. And then within our family, within the media, within religious institutions, within educational institutions, we begin to experience socialization that leads us to stereotypical assumptions around people. And the media influences very strongly around that as well. All right, so kind of moving on, stereotypes is a form of prejudice. Why is it that all Latinos in films are like gang members and tattooed and dangerous and drug dealers and don't speak English and have heavy accents? That's because there's not a lot of Latinos in Hollywood. Because if there were a lot of Latinos in Hollywood, they would try to break or disrupt that stereotype. Right. So these three Chicanos or Latinos are gang members. They're cholos, right? Why aren't Latinos presented as doctors and PhDs like me, right? I don't know. Maybe because that's not going to sell. Discrimination, remember, is the action associated with the prejudicial attitudes and judgments that people make. You can have one without the other, but they are related. Okay. Racism is, you've got historical racism, you've got institutionalized racism, you've got individual racism. So there's different layers to, you have colorism, there's different dynamics associated with that. But when we talk about racism, we're talking about the historical, institutional, and individual subordination of one group of individuals based on race to another. Okay. And that's going to influence their access to resources. It's going to influence their ability to acquire opportunities that other people have. Scapegoat theory is also an idea that's discussed in this chapter. And scapegoat theory says that you find a group that has some kind of identifiability, racially speaking, especially, and then you target them for some of the problems to carry and to be the blame and the source of some of the problems in the society. So President Trump really kind of used this during his first election in 2016 when he announced that he was running for president. He said Mexico is sending their rapists, these criminals, these drug dealers, they're very bad people. And he kind of tried to scapegoat these Mexican immigrants, the most powerless in our society, for being the reason that our economy was tanking or declining, right? And historically, that's what happened, right? Hitler used Jews for the economic collapse, and he blamed them for why things were not going well in the nation. And historically, people of minority status, racial minority status, have gotten scapegoated for lots of reasons. And what it does is it really kind of ratchets people's emotions up, and they look for someone to blame for the problems they have, when in reality, it's much bigger and more complex than that, right? Your book in chapter 9 talks about assimilation and pluralism. So when we talk about these dynamics of race and ethnicity, you know, you can't separate what happened in the past in terms of historical racism to from what is currently being experienced by any particular population. So this book kind of highlights the idea of generations of exclusion. You know, Mexican Americans have historically for generations been excluded from participation in the educational systems, the economic systems, the political systems, right? And they're relegated, if they're allowed to get into these systems, they're relegated to a minority status with inferior access to resources and opportunities. Historically, that's been the case through segregation, through exclusion, and discriminatory practices, right? So this quote right here by Samuel P. Huntington says, "There is no Americano dream. There's only the American dream created by an Anglo-Protestant society. Mexican Americans will share in that dream and in that society only if they dream in English." And that's really kind of pressing for the argument that if you're going to experience the American dream, you better let go of your Spanish. You better become Americanized, right? And I see the truth of this. You know, my grandfather, he never learned to speak English, and he was poor as a result of it. He was relegated to manufacturing warehouse plants in El Paso, Texas, and he died. He was denied the American dream because he didn't assimilate. And that's what we tell immigrants. You will assimilate if you want the American dream. If you don't, you're not going to get the dream. All right. That was told to my mom. That was told to me. That was told to my grandfather, and it's going to be told to my children. Your book discusses amalgamation. And just as I shared earlier, one of the things about amalgamation I want to kind of argue is that, you know, amalgamation means that it's the construction of a new group. Okay. And when the United States was founded, it was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to be that American was an ethnic identity. Like, it was believed that all these people were going to come to the United States and amalgamate, engage in amalgamation and create something new, a new people, a new society called Americans. That really didn't happen. All these immigrants that came off these boats, all these white immigrants, these Italians, these Irish, these Germans, these Hungarians, these Slovakians, all these people all these white Americans, what are considered today white Americans, who weren't considered white at the time, amalgamated. It was believed they were going to amalgamate to become Americans, but they never did. We more than likely had something called assimilation, which is basically Anglo-conformity. And that's where a group adopts the dominant group's values, cultural beliefs, and language. Okay, so the United States is more of an assimilationist model than an amalgamation model. It never kind of came to realize that. Because especially now, right, we have a lot of emphasis on racial categorizations and ethnic identification. Assimilation does serve some benefits from a functional perspective. It leads to upward social mobility. So I have experienced the American dream, and it's not a coincidence that que ya no hablo español. It's not a coincidence that I no longer speak Spanish, right? I moved up into the middle class, but I had to let go of my language and I had to let go of my culture. Some would say that that's not worth it. Maybe, is it possible to retain your culture and be in the middle class? Maybe, I don't know. I never got to see it, but it might be. But most immigrant populations lose their cultural distinctiveness in order to acquire upward social mobility. And that's been true for most white Americans. The Irish, the German, the Italian, the Russian, the Ukrainian, they assimilate over generations, intergenerationally, and they achieve the dream. But they lose their cultural distinctiveness. Okay, all right. And most of it is an adoption of an Anglo-Protestant, Anglo-Saxon kind of perspective or worldview. All right, that's called the Americanization process, right? Okay, we also have something called pluralism that's discussed in your text. And pluralism is this idea that rather than having us all kind of adopt Anglo-conformity, Anglo-Protestant, Anglo-Saxon Protestant conformity, we ultimately allow cultures to retain their distinctions. And so there's a very low degree of cultural assimilation. This is kind of what we see right now. You have structural pluralism and cultural pluralism. So that's associated with like the Chinese, the Irish, the Italian. They make the salad bowl, right? So amalgamation is the melting pot, and then pluralism is the salad bowl. All right, you have different types of ethnic intergroup contacts. Expulsion. This was during the 1960s and 70s with the Nation of Islam and people arguing that African Americans should be shipped back to Africa. You have the internment, the forced internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II. Those are two examples of expulsion. Genocide, here are a couple of examples in our contemporary society. So the Rwandan, the genocide that took place between the Tutsi and the Hutu. You have the German World War II Holocaust with Jews, homosexuals, and other ethnic and political minorities. And then you had even currently in 2022, the genocide in Burma. So we've had racial, alongside genocide, you have ethnic violence or racial violence. These are just a couple of examples of riots that took place in Los Angeles, the riots that took place during Derek Floyd protests or the Trayvon Martin protests. Earlier in the 1990s, you had the Rodney King riots. So you have those kind of things. Your book argues that there's different perspectives to race and racial ethnic identity and interactions. So from a functionalist perspective, race serves a role of creating an intergroup dynamic, intergroup solidarity. That's the benefit to the racial, from the functionalist perspective, the benefit to the racial dynamics. Okay, now it fails to account for the fact that that same positive benefit of intergroup solidarity leads to intergroup conflict. Okay, but nonetheless, like the idea from a functionalist perspective is that there are some benefits to the racial dynamics that are presenting themselves, and it leads to the manifest and latent functions that people perform in the broader society in which we live. Okay, from a conflict perspective, as I already talked earlier, it's basically the relationship between a subordinate and a dominant group. And that leads to inequality and oppression. And then from a symbolic interactions perspective, it's the idea that race is nothing more than a social construction and the implications of race associated with it, which are all the stereotypes, narratives, and prejudices that people possess. From a symbolic interactionist perspective, race becomes a master status. And all the ideas that people have about who you are because of your race ultimately kind of come to define your potential opportunities and life chances in life. All right, so last but not least, we have gender. In chapter 12, we have gender, sex, and sexuality. Now, there's a lot going on here. One of the things I want to kind of highlight associated with stratification, which was chapters 9, and race, chapters 11, and then this chapter, is that something called feminization of poverty. right? So the feminization of poverty argues that women are historically and categorically being bearing the brunt of poverty in our society. And it's the brunt because of the limited economic opportunities that are afforded in spite of an increased educational attainment, as well as the burden and the responsibilities that are foisted on women in terms of childcare, in terms of the third and the second shift and the third shift, the emotional labor they have to engage in at home, the physical labor they have to engage in at work. All of that kind of compounds onto women. And the idea is that our poor are increasingly women and mothers, single women and mothers. And that's not a coincidence, because women are also a minority population. Remember, when we talk about minorities, and this is related to chapter 11, when we talk about minorities are not, it's not about numbers, it's about power. And historically, females have not had access to the conduits of power and the access to resources and opportunities that men have. Okay. Although things have improved, things have also been still very hard for females. All right. So when we talk about gender, here's the thing that we want to kind of keep in mind. Gender and sex are not mutually exclusive terms. Okay. They are, or actually they're mutually exclusive. They're not the same. Gender is a social construct, and it's related to the values, beliefs, and performance. It's a social positioning that a person possesses in the broader society of the structured order between men and women. Okay, so when we talk about gender, we're talking about femininity, we're talking about masculinity, we're talking about a performativity, and it's a position that places women beneath men, or men above women. Okay. And evidence of this, for example, is just think of the ways in which women who have multiple sexual partners are labeled or stereotyped, and men who have multiple sexual partners are stereotyped. Women are stereotyped much more negatively, even just in language, than men who do the same thing. Same behavior, but totally different connotations and totally different labels. When we talk about sex, we're talking about the biological anatomy that a person possesses, male and female, right? A couple of other terms that are important to keep in mind. You have sometimes intersexed individuals. Not all of us are born phenotypically clear. So there are some individuals who, during the developmental process, the developmental phase in the womb, begin to present themselves as one way, and then something happens in their development that leads them to be intersexed. So they no longer, they don't get all the way to being a male. They don't get all the way to being a female in terms of anatomy. So we all start off as females. To give you an example, we all start off as females in the womb, and yet at some point hormones start pumping and kicking in, and we're going to become men. And in order to be, let's say that happens, what happens is that in that developmental process, there are some men, because the hormones don't kick in appropriately, who end up with something called micropenises. So a micropenis is a penis that's a couple of centimeters long, right? Like centimeters. Well, so much so that it looks like an enlarged clitoris more than it does a penis. And vice versa. Some females in the developmental process have some kind of mix up with the hormones, and their clitoris ultimately becomes extremely enlarged and maldeveloped, so that it looks more like a penis than it does a female clitoris. And so some individuals are intersexed. Now, it's a small minority of individuals that are intersexed, but there are some people who are born anatomically and biologically ambiguous. Are you a male if you have a penis that's 1 or 2 centimeters long? Well, genetically speaking, biologically speaking, you could say yes, the chromosomes say it. But what does that mean socially? Right? Now, going on to this, so that's the term intersex. Sometimes, though, some people are intersexed as a result of accidents. So this is David Reimer. David Reimer was born a boy. And when he was 9 months old, 6 or 9 months old, he was taken to the doctor to be circumcised. But there was an accident, so his penis was burned off. So David Reimer's penis is burned off. The doctors don't know what to do. They talk to the parents and they say, look, he's still very young. We could just remove what's left, because there was nothing left. It was burned off. We could build a vagina for him, and you could dress David as a female, and she will never know that she was born a male. Parents didn't know much about this, and so they went through with the doctor's expertise and recommendations, and they ultimately. Now David was a twin, okay, just so you know. So now they had an opportunity to contrast David's gender as a female with his twin brother's masculinity and male identity. And so they dressed David as a female. I forgot what they gave the name for David was. But they dressed him as a female. They dressed her as a female. She became a female. But right around the ages of 5 or 6 years of age, when she started going to school, she started ripping her dresses off. She didn't want to dress like a girl. And then as she got older, David began to present very physical features. He was about 13 or 14 years old. He started growing facial hair. And so you can imagine he was going through a crisis. He didn't know what to do. Kids started teasing him because he started looking more and more like a male, in spite of the fact that his parents did everything they could to keep him looking like a female. And so they told him, they said, David, we're sorry, you were actually a boy. You can imagine the psychological dissonance, the cognitive dissonance that this presented to him, the emotional and psychological fallout. And so David ultimately underwent therapy. He embraced his male identity. Again, he got surgery. He eventually did get married. And then he committed suicide right around the age of 34 or something like that, because he was never able to heal from the trauma that he experienced as a result of his intersex nature. Okay, so that's just one example of how profoundly impactful gender can be. There are also individuals who are transgender. A transgender individual is a person whose gender identity is one that closely identifies with the opposite gender. So it's a person who doesn't conform to societal gendered norms regarding the body they're born with anatomically, and so intimately identifies with the opposite gender that they begin to perform in the gender of opposite of themselves biologically. Okay, so that's a transgender individual. Transsexuals, that's a term that's not really used anymore. It was in the past. I think transgender has just kind of become the more common label, but in the past, the difference between a transgender individual and a transsexual individual is that the transsexual undergoes sexual reassignment surgery. They so intimately identify with the opposite sex, and not just the opposite gender, that they undergo some sexual reassignment surgery, and they ultimately become a member of the opposite sex and perform in the gender associated with that sex. I give you some examples of what this looks like. These individuals, all of these, are individuals who have undergone sexual reassignment surgery and are competing in a transsexual beauty contest. And this right now is really a hot topic in regards to sports, like who decides whether a transsexual male or female or a person who undergoes sexual reassignment surgery should be able to compete in particular based on the sex that they occupy currently because of the sexual reassignment surgery. My apologies, everybody. All right, I'm almost done. Okay, so gender identity, it's strongly and profoundly impacted by the process of socialization. A lot of media influences how we perceive ourselves in terms of our gender and the gender identity we have. So you've got this 13 surgeries, right? Kim Kardashian has undergone a lot of surgeries as well. Females increasingly are pressured to look a particular way because of the gender identity formation and the expectations associated with what a gender is supposed to be or look like, right? So men are supposed to be like this, women are supposed to be like that, whatever it is. So there's all these concepts and conceptualizations and associations we make with the particular genders that people have or are. When we talk about sexuality, historically in the United States, we've really kind of possessed a binary view of sexual orientation, that people are gay or straight, not really realizing that there's also this continuum of sorts in terms of the sexual attraction that people have. So we're no longer thinking that as much as we used to, at least in American society, around a gay or straight kind of thing, right? The question around whether our sexuality is something that's innately, genetically circumscribed or predisposed for us, or if it's socially influenced, is another question that's going on and currently being debated. You know, there is no gay gene, right? And so we're still trying to work that out in terms of like, where is it exactly that someone's sexual orientation comes from? We do know that society influences this quite a bit. People have been socialized towards heteronormativity and heterosexuality for a very long period in American history, and it's taken a lot of force to really kind of resist those dominant socialization processes and forces. There was a guy named Alfred Kinsey who put forth queer theory, and the idea was that that sexuality is not on a binary; it's actually a continuum, and it's not fixed. That we can find ourselves attracted sexually to various individuals on a continuum, and it's not that I'm gay or I'm straight. A good example of this would be what takes place with heterosexual men who consider themselves heterosexual in prison, but engage in homosexual activity. That is, they have sex with men. They go in heterosexual, they come out heterosexual. They never define themselves as homosexual, but they engage in homosexual activity consistently for the years that they're in prison. Right. So you've got questions about what that's all about. The family plays a very prominent role in our socialization into our gender identity. As I shared before in an earlier lecture, when we're born, even before we're born, our parents are deciding what kind of clothes we're going to wear. Boys are going to wear jeans, girls are going to wear dresses, what kind of colors we're going to be interacting with, what kind of toys we're going to be playing with. And that leads us to the formation of the gender roles that we will eventually occupy as adults. Okay. Our peers reinforce traditional gender norms. Our household labor reinforces it as well, right? Like who's cleaning the restroom at your home? Usually it's females. Who's mowing the lawn? Usually it's males. Who's cooking? Usually it's females. Historically, we haven't seen a lot of change in this. Like during Thanksgiving, who's sitting down watching TV? And who's on their feet? Right? More than likely, it's going to be females on their feet, and more than likely men watching TV. The media influences us very strongly as well. The books that we read, the media that we occupy, certainly TikTok and movies, video games, right? The sexualization and objectification of women is something that we see quite a bit of. And what I'll do now is I'm going to go ahead and let you all watch a classic example of what this looks like today.
What's amazing when you look at Disney and Disney movies over the years is how little the image of females has really changed. You still have the same highly sexualized female body with the big breasts, the tiny waists, the fluttering eyelashes, the coy expressions, the seductress. These images seem very similar over the years, and even when they're in animal form, you've got this very seductive little female animal.
Hello.
What we find is that this presents people with a kind of notion of what femininity is about. This is not a mirror on society. This is not reflecting who women really are or what females really are. It is basically constructing notions of what femininity is. And these are not notions that necessarily Disney invented, but what they do with these notions is they caricature them. They wrap them up in this Magic Kingdom wrapper and they sell them to children. And that's really the power of Disney.
When they're young, they're trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a woman? What do I look like if I'm a girl? What should I look like? And they'll focus on the most salient, dramatic images they can see. They don't necessarily think about, well, that doesn't look like the women I know in real life. They don't make those kinds of comparisons, because that's kind of like making a movie, putting a whole story together, doing logical comparisons. They think about one slide at a time. This is how it looks here. Gee, that's interesting. Maybe I want to look like that. So it shapes kids' images about how they're going to look.
There's no one as burly and brawny.
As you see, I've got biceps to spare.
Not a bit of him scraggly or scrawny.
That's right. And every last inch of me's covered with hair.
In Beauty and the Beast, you have Lumiere, the candlestick, and the broom, the feminine broom, acting out these male-female themes where he's the aggressor and she's saying, oh, no, no, no. And then, by golly, he sweeps her off her feet after she said no, 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 no.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
I've been banned by you before.
So it's a replication of the woman as holding back, woman as being coquettish, or even woman as saying, no, I don't want this, but what she really means is, yes, I do.
Jasmine in the Aladdin film, in which there's a scene where she becomes a seductress to distract the person who's after Aladdin.
I never realized how incredibly handsome you are.
That's better. Now, Pussycat, tell me more about myself.
Your beard is so twisted.
This I find very dangerous because you have, again, it gives young girls and the idea that that is the way that you get what you want. You use your body to manipulate people into, and specifically men, into to get what it is that you want.
One of the themes seen repeatedly in Disney's movies is that however strong or powerful a female character may be, she still needs to be rescued by a male. In the world of Disney, females not only get into trouble easily, they also lack the ability to save their own lives. This is true even of Disney's films of the 80s and 90s.
Princess Mermaid one is a really big theme with girls. When I just walked into the room, two of the girls were playing. One girl was laying, dying, and the other one was crying. And one of the girls was playing at the playground, and she was up against a fence like this, and the boys were coming to her rescue. And how it had happened so early, it amazes me that they grab onto that.
When you look at the image of Snow White today, you know, with a sort of feminist sensibility, you realise how ridiculous the image is. Here you've got this young female, completely isolated, at home, enjoying cooking and cleaning, and her friends are the animals, and she's happy. I mean, it just makes no sense today, given that feminism and feminist discourse has seeped down into everyday life.
Now you wash the dishes. You tidy up the room. You clean the fireplace. And I'll use the broom.
So what Disney has to do in order to keep up with the themes of a society is they have to keep changing. In Little Mermaid, you know, she does defy her father. There is a sense of a more powerful female here.
I set certain rules, and I expect those rules to be obeyed.
You don't even know him.
Know him? I don't have to know him. They're all the same, incapable of any feeling.
Daddy, I love him!
But of course, ultimately, she's willing to give up her voice to get the mail. And once she's given up the voice, the only thing she has left to get him is the body. Now, a more interesting, complex reality is Mulan, where this is a very powerful, strong character who almost single-handedly wins the war. And so we do have a real independent female. However, after the war, and she goes home, then the expectations of femininity are exactly the same. It's as if it never happened.
Great. She brings home a sword. If you ask me, she should have brought home a man.
Excuse me. Does Fa Mulan live here?
We have examples like Beauty and the Beast, where their argument was this is a strong, powerful woman. And why is she strong and powerful? Because she's reading a book.
Ah, Belle.
Good morning. I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Well, in reality, it's just a pseudo-feminism. Because ultimately, in Beauty and the Beast, is that she marries a batterer.
A great deal of my work in my professional life has to do with family violence. And when you look at that movie with that eye, the abuse is horrific.
No, Belle, listen to me. I'm old. I've lived my life.
Wait.
Belle!
Wait!
He screams at her. He imprisons her. He throws her father out the door and rips her family away from her. His behavior is, without question, frankly and horrifically abusive.
Where is she?
She's not coming.
What?
Your Grace! Your Eminence!
I thought I told you to come down to dinner.
I'm not hungry.
You'll come out or I'll break down the door.
Gently, gently.
Will you come down to dinner? Please.
No, thank you.
You can't stay in there forever.
Yes, I can.
Fine. Then go ahead and starve! If she doesn't eat with me, then she doesn't eat at all.
And yet the whole thrust of the story is that she returns to him, that she socializes him, that she excuses him, that she reinterprets his rage and his abuse as temper, that she reinterprets his personality as tender and vulnerable, and then that she falls in love with him.
There's something sweet and almost kind, but he was mean and he was coarse and unrefined, and now he's dear and so unsure. I wonder why I didn't see it there before.
And this is a movie that is saying to our children, overlook the abuse, overlook the violence. There's a tender prince lurking within, and it's your job to kiss that prince and bring it out, or to kiss that beast and bring the prince out. That's a dangerous message.
If Belle was my friend and I saw what happened to her, like yelling and romantic, I'd be happy for her because she found someone who she liked, and I would be happy for her that she likes the beast and that she would stay with him, but I'd also feel bad for her because she gets yelled at a lot. If Belle was my friend and I'd seen her go through this whole thing, I'd probably just say, keep on being nice and sweet like you are, and that would probably change him. And in the movie, it does.